This has gone horribly badly for Russia. The Ukrainians have been suffering immensely as a consequence of that, and increasingly the potential that it's dragging in the West in a way that is going to have longer-term implications is also growing. So the good news is that the ability and willingness of the West to coordinate in punishing the Russians and supporting the Ukrainians has been strong and consistent. And despite what has been said by some on the progressive left and some on the MAGA right, I don't think that's going to meaningfully change in 2023. In other words, the US is going to provide the majority of the military support, and the Europeans are going to continue to provide the majority of the financial support, and that will prevent the Russians from being able to go back into Kiev. But the fact that the Russians are doing so badly, and that Putin has had to announce a mobilization of 300,000 troops, which he didn't want to do, has led Russia to start taking other steps that they hadn't been taking, like going after civilian electricity infrastructure in Ukraine. And if you watch state media in Russia, and I don't suggest you do that because it's not good for you, but when I do, it's very clear. I mean, the Russians are now admitting they're losing territory. They're admitting it's going badly, but it's not because they're fighting the Ukrainians, it's because they're fighting NATO. So the big question is not for me about tactical nukes, it's about whether or not the Russians are going to turn the war towards NATO. Will they engage in asymmetrical strikes against pipelines, fiber, cyber attacks, espionage that would actually hit NATO and especially NATO frontline countries? I think that's an enormous concern. And unlike the use of a tactical nuke, which would elicit an immediate and extraordinary American response against Russian forces in Ukraine and the Black Sea, and they know that, the response that would come from NATO if the Russians just engage in asymmetrical warfare against NATO is hard to know because, I mean, they're being sanctioned maximally, and the provision of weapons and training and intelligence, I mean, that's been about as high as anyone wants to go, short of steps that they think would potentially really escalate the war directly. So the West will be in a difficult position if Putin decides that's where he wants to go. Final point for me on this is that we need to understand that one of the reasons I'm so negative about this is because I don't see how the Russians end up in a normal position. Like, at least in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation, when both sides decided to step back, they were at the status quo ante. The Soviets were still the Soviets, the Americans were still the Americans. This time around, like, as we look forward over the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years, under any circumstances, Putin's Russia will look like a rogue state. We'll have an economy which is collapsing. We'll be on the back foot against Ukraine, which will be the best armed state in Europe with an expanded NATO that's getting into the EU. I don't know how you stabilize that vis-a-vis Putin's Russia, and I don't think Putin's going anywhere anytime soon. So I do think this is a truly dangerous turn of events structurally for the geopolitical order. If we look at Putin's horrible misjudgment to invade Ukraine, we have to understand that as well orchestrated as the alliance has been in response to February 24th, in the run-up to February 24th, every signal that was being given to Putin was pretty much that this is going to be an opportune time for you to take a munch, right? I mean, you look at where the US was on Afghanistan and how the Allies reacted to that. You look at Merkel no longer being there. You look at France and strategic autonomy. Biden met with Putin, and when he did, back a year and a half ago, he wasn't talking about Ukraine, he was talking about cyber and the Colonial Pipeline. You know what? Putin responded on that, and he rolled those guys up, and he said, okay, we'll stop hitting you on critical infrastructure. And then Xi Jinping met with Putin and said, yes, you're our best friend on the global stage. So I really do believe that Putin had lots of reasons pre-February 24th to think this is not going to be such a big deal. Now, he also made huge misjudgments on the state of his military, which is a different story. But in terms of how he assessed the international community and the response, I don't think Putin was so off in terms of what he had seen coming to him. Where you listen to what Kevin just said, what Xi Jinping is seeing right now on the global stage is exactly the opposite. This would be a really bad time to try to suddenly push the issue, whether it's directly on Taiwan or more broadly, towards an overtly confrontational stance towards the West, precisely because the West is so aligned. The G7 is so workable. China is on the back foot with the Russians, and and all the economic reasons that. So assuming some level of rationality on the part of both of these actors, which I think is always a good way to start, that implies that Putin was going to be more of a risk taker, and Xi Jinping not so much, at least not right now.
I think there were two different points of missing the boat on Russia. The first is that in the Yeltsin days and early Putin days, the ability, the interest in making the NATO-Russia Joint Council into more than it actually was, more than a fig leaf, trying to really integrate them, I think would have been useful. The idea of doing more than just shock therapy, but trying to actually help rebuild the Russian economy would have made a difference. So one is the active pull. The other is the push. I think the idea under Bush of inviting the Georgians and the Ukrainians to be a part of NATO, especially over fairly sharp reservations of other NATO allies in Europe, was a bridge too far and was kind of a rag to a bull that the Russians were going to have major structural issues with, but without creating the deterrent. Because if you're saying we're going to let you in, but you don't let them in, then they don't actually have any of the guarantees, the security guarantees that would prevent the Russians from invading. And again, we saw that in 2008 in Georgia, we saw it in 2014 in Ukraine, and then we saw it again in 2022. So I would say that at the margins, both of those things were mistakes. But those were, that is not to say that Putin is anything less than 100% responsible for the unjust invasion of a sovereign territory on February 24th. I want to be clear about that. I think like so many things in the world today, we're not looking for sudden harmony and peace. We're looking for an off-ramp. We're looking for stabilization. We want to stop the escalation. So can we do that? In the near term, I think we can do that. I think that the Russian 300,000 troops that are going to the front lines can't take territory. They won't be well armed or trained, but they might be able to dig in and prevent the Ukrainians from breaking through and surrounding Crimea or even attacking it. I think that is the most likely outcome in the next 2 to 4 months, especially talking about winter months with a lot of Ukrainians suffering and with no ground cover, so you need to dig in as opposed to places where you're exposed and satellites can hit you. So I could see a situation in the next couple months where the front lines don't move very much, and it looks like we don't talk about Ukraine as much in the headlines as a consequence.